It was an ordinary morning in the bustling city streets when Officer Mark Spencer, a seasoned cop with a reputation for being tough on crime, spotted a homeless man sitting on the sidewalk. The man looked disheveled, his clothes worn and frayed, and a cardboard sign by his side read, "Hungry and homeless. Please help." Without a second thought, Officer Spencer approached, his stern expression signaling trouble. But what began as a routine confrontation quickly spiraled into something no one could have expected. The officer's voice was sharp as he demanded the man move along. The homeless man, James Carter, remained calm, his voice quiet and respectful as he explained he had nowhere else to go. But Spencer wasn't interested in excuses. Within minutes, the cop arrested James, accusing him of loitering and disrupting public peace. By now, a small crowd had gathered, some recording the incident on their phones, while others whispered among themselves, unsure whether to intervene. As James was placed in the back of the squad car, something fell from his coat pocket, a small object that would change everything. A pair of dog tags, dull with age but unmistakably linked to a military past. Spencer barely noticed at first, dismissing it as junk, but soon he would uncover the truth behind James Carter's story, a truth so powerful it would shake him to his core. What was James Carter's past? Why was he on the streets? And how would this discovery alter not only Officer Spencer's life, but also the lives of everyone watching? Stay tuned, because this is a story of judgment, redemption, and the unshakable spirit of a man who deserved more than the world had given him. Officer Mark Spencer was no stranger to the streets. A tough cop with years of experience, he had seen it all: crime, poverty, and the struggles of those living on the edge. That morning, as he patrolled the city, his eyes landed on a man sitting quietly against the wall of a convenience store. The man's scruffy appearance, tangled hair, and worn-out boots painted the picture of someone down on his luck. Beside him lay a small pile of belongings: a torn blanket, a cup with a few coins, and a sign asking for help. Mark sighed heavily. He didn't like dealing with the homeless population. In his mind, they were a problem, an eyesore in an otherwise bustling city. As he stepped out of his patrol car, he adjusted his belt and put on his stern face. He approached the man, who didn't seem to notice him at first. "Hey, you can't sit here," Mark barked, his tone sharp and commanding. The man looked up slowly, his brown eyes calm and tired. "I'm not bothering anyone," he replied softly. His voice had a quiet dignity that caught Mark off guard, but the officer didn't let it show. "You're loitering," Mark snapped. "Move along or I'll have to take you in." The man sighed, his shoulders slumping as he picked up his belongings. "I'm not looking for trouble, officer," he said. "I just needed a moment to rest." Mark's patience was wearing thin. A small crowd had started to gather nearby, watching the interaction. Some people pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Mark could feel their eyes on him, judging his every move. He hated being scrutinized, but he was determined to maintain control of the situation. "Rest somewhere else," Mark ordered, but the man didn't move fast enough for his liking. Frustrated, Mark grabbed his arm and pulled him up. "I said, move along." The man winced, dropping a small item from his coat pocket as he stumbled. Mark glanced down and saw a pair of dog tags lying on the pavement. They were old and scuffed, but clearly military-issued. For a moment, Mark hesitated, his grip loosening slightly. "What's this?" he asked, picking up the dog tags. The man's expression changed. His tired eyes filled with pain, but he didn't answer right away. Mark frowned, growing impatient. "I asked you a question," he said, shaking the tags in front of the man's face. "They're mine," the man said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark's brow furrowed. He didn't expect this. "You're military?" he asked skeptically, his tone laced with disbelief. "Was," the man replied. "A long time ago." Mark wasn't convinced. He tightened his grip on the man's arm and motioned toward his car. "You can explain that down at the station," he said. The man didn't resist as Mark led him to the patrol car. The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads, others filming as the scene unfolded. As Mark drove to the station, he couldn't help but glance at the man in the rearview mirror. There was something about him that didn't add up. His calm demeanor, his quiet dignity, it didn't match the image Mark had in his head of a troublemaker. And those dog tags? Mark shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside. He wasn't paid to feel sorry for people. His job was to enforce the law. When they arrived at the station, Mark booked the man, listing his name as James Carter. The process was routine: fingerprints, a mugshot, and a cell. But something about it felt wrong. As Mark walked away, he found himself holding onto the dog tags. He turned them over in his hand, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man? Why was he on the streets? And why did he feel a strange sense of guilt, as if he had just done something terribly wrong? Mark decided to dig deeper. He sat at his desk, typing James Carter's name into the system. The records took a moment to load, but when they did, Mark's eyes widened. There it was, plain as day, a military service record. James Carter was a veteran, a man who had served his country with honor. Mark leaned back in his chair, his stomach twisting in knots. He had just arrested a homeless veteran, a man who had once fought for the freedoms Mark himself took for granted. Before he could process his thoughts, Mark was interrupted by a fellow officer. "You okay?" the officer asked, noticing the troubled look on Mark's face. Mark replied, quickly closing the file. But he wasn't okay. He couldn't shake the image of James sitting quietly on the sidewalk, his tired eyes and those dog tags. For the first time in a long time, Mark felt doubt creeping into his mind. Had he judged too quickly? Had he made a mistake? As the day went on, Mark couldn't focus. He found himself thinking about James and his story. What had happened to him? How had he ended up on the streets? And, most importantly, what could Mark do to make it right? Mark couldn't get James Carter out of his head. The more he thought about the man, the more he felt a nagging guilt. Sitting at his desk, he picked up the dog tags once again, their weight feeling heavier than ever. The engraved name, James E. Carter, and a military ID number stared back at him, a silent reminder of the man he had just thrown in a cell. Unable to focus, Mark decided to dig deeper. He pulled up James's service record on his computer. The details left him stunned. James Carter had served in the Army for over a decade, including 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. He had been awarded multiple medals for bravery, including a Bronze Star. But his record wasn't spotless. Toward the end of his service, James had been diagnosed with PTSD, and shortly after returning home, his life began to unravel. Mark read about the difficulties James had faced: trouble finding steady work, a divorce that left him without a home, and a string of bad luck that eventually landed him on the streets. Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. This man wasn't just another problem to sweep away. He was a hero, someone who had given so much for his country and received so little in return. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed James, not just as a cop, but as a human being. As the day wore on, Mark's guilt deepened. He found himself pacing the station, unable to sit still. Finally, he decided to visit James in his cell. As he approached, he saw the man sitting on the cold metal bench. his head bowed, and his hands resting on his knees. The quiet dignity James carried earlier was still there, but it was tinged with exhaustion and sadness. Mark cleared his throat, and James looked up, his brown eyes meeting Mark's. "What do you want?" James asked, his voice steady but tired. Mark hesitated for a moment. I wanted to talk," he said, fumbling for the right words, "about your service." James raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "My service? Why now?" "I looked you up," Mark admitted, holding out the dog tags. I didn't know." James took the dog tags from Mark's hand, his fingers closing around them protectively. He didn't say anything, just stared at them for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "I served. A long time ago. Doesn't seem to matter much now." "It does matter," Mark said quickly, surprising even himself with the conviction in his voice. "You're a veteran. You've been through things most people can't imagine. And he paused, struggling to find the words. "I treated you like a criminal. I'm sorry." James looked at him, his expression softening slightly. "Sorry doesn't change much," he said, "but I appreciate it." Mark nodded, his chest tightening. "I want to help," he said, "if you'll let me." James studied him for a moment, his eyes searching Mark's face for sincerity. Finally, he nodded. Help how? That was a question Mark hadn't fully thought through. He knew he wanted to make things right, but he didn't know where to start. "For now," he said, "how about we just talk?" Over the next hour, James opened up about his life, his struggles, and the events that had led him to the streets. He talked about the horrors of war, the friends he had lost, and the crushing weight of PTSD. He described the loneliness of coming home to a world that didn't understand him, the frustration of being unable to find work, and the heartbreak of losing his family. Mark listened intently, his respect for James growing with every word. He realized how little he knew about the challenges veterans faced, and he couldn't help but feel ashamed of the assumptions he had made. By the time James finished speaking, Mark was determined to do more than just apologize. He wanted to take action. The next morning, Mark went to his superior with James's file in hand. "We need to do something for this guy," he said, his tone firm. "He's not a criminal. He's a veteran who's fallen on hard times." His superior raised an eyebrow. "And what do you propose we do? We can't just let him go." "I'll vouch for him," Mark said without hesitation, "and I'll find him help." His superior sighed. "This isn't exactly protocol, Spencer." "I know," Mark admitted, "but it's the right thing to do." After some back and forth, Mark's superior agreed to release James into his custody, provided Mark took full responsibility. Relieved, Mark went to James's cell and told him the news. "They're letting you go," Mark said. "But you're coming with me." James looked at him, surprised. "With you? Why?" "Because I'm not just letting you walk out of here with nowhere to go," Mark said. "We're going to figure this out together." James hesitated, but he finally nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's see where this goes." Mark took James to a local Veterans Outreach Center, a place he had researched the night before. The staff there were warm and welcoming, immediately sitting down with James to assess his needs. They arranged for him to have a bed in a nearby shelter, as well as counseling sessions to address his PTSD. As they left the center, James turned to Mark. "I didn't expect this," he said. "Thank you." Mark shrugged, feeling a bit awkward. "It's the least I could do." But Mark didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, he checked in on James regularly, making sure he had what he needed. He helped him navigate the complicated process of applying for veterans' benefits and even connected him with a job training program. Slowly but surely, James began to rebuild his life. One day, as they sat in a coffee shop, James looked at Mark and said, "You didn't have to do any of this. Why did you?" Mark thought for a moment before answering. "Because I was wrong," he said, "and because you deserved better." James nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Well, you made a difference. More than you know." Mark couldn't shake the feeling that helping James wasn't enough. The story wasn't just about one man. It was about a system that had failed so many. Mark started looking into how other veterans in the community were treated. What he found shocked him. Stories of forgotten heroes living on the streets, battling PTSD without support, and struggling to find work or housing flooded his mind. It was overwhelming, but it fueled a fire inside him. He couldn't just let James be another statistic. One evening, Mark found himself sitting at his kitchen table, papers spread out in front of him, reports from the Veterans Outreach Center, articles about homelessness among veterans, and printouts of online forums filled the space. He was digging into statistics, reading personal accounts, and learning about the programs that were supposed to help veterans but often fell short. He realized that many of these issues were systemic, deeply rooted in bureaucracy and indifference. The more he read, the angrier he got. How could people who had served their country end up like this, forgotten and abandoned? He knew he couldn't fix everything, but he could start with James. Mark reached out to a local news reporter he knew, Sarah. She had a reputation for covering community issues and wasn't afraid to ask tough questions. "I've got a story for you," he said when they met at a coffee shop downtown. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as Mark explained James's situation and how his arrest had led to a deeper realization about the struggles veterans faced. He also mentioned the lack of resources and the staggering number of veterans living on the streets. Sarah was immediately intrigued. "This could be powerful," she said, sipping her coffee. "But are you ready for the attention this might bring? It's not just about James. It's about holding people accountable." Mark nodded, his expression serious. "I'm ready. This needs to change." The next week, Sarah's feature story aired on the local news. It included interviews with James, Mark, and staff from the Veterans Outreach Center. The piece was raw and emotional, showing clips of James's time on the streets, the arrest footage, and his journey toward rebuilding his life. The story highlighted the challenges veterans faced and the lack of resources available to them. It also showcased Mark's transformation from a cop enforcing the law to a man determined to change it. The story went viral. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Support Our Veterans" and "James Deserves Justice." People from all over the country reached out, offering donations, job opportunities, and words of encouragement for James and other veterans. The Veterans Outreach Center reported a surge in volunteers and funding, allowing them to expand their programs and help more people. James, meanwhile, was adjusting to his new life. He had found a job through the training program Mark connected him with and was saving up for his own place. The counseling sessions were helping him cope with his PTSD, and he was beginning to feel like himself again. He even started volunteering at the Outreach Center, helping other veterans who were struggling. But he never forgot how close he had come to losing everything, and how one person's decision to care had changed his life. Mark and James became unlikely friends. They often met for coffee, talking about everything from their favorite sports teams to their shared frustration with the system. James started to open up more, sharing stories from his time in the Army, and even cracking jokes. Mark, in turn, shared his own struggles as a cop trying to navigate a broken system. The friendship was unexpected, but deeply meaningful for both of them. One day, as they sat in the park where they had first crossed paths, James said, "You know, I used to think nobody cared, that the world had just moved on without me." Mark looked at him, his expression serious. "A lot of people do care. They just don't know how to help. You've shown them why they should." James smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Maybe, but it started with you." The story didn't just change James's life, it changed Mark's too. He started advocating for reforms within the police department, pushing for better training on how to handle situations involving homeless people, veterans, and others in vulnerable positions. His colleagues were resistant at first, dismissing his ideas as unnecessary or impractical. But Mark's passion was contagious. Slowly, he began to see shifts in how his department approached these cases. Officers started taking more time to understand the people they were interacting with, and the number of arrests for minor infractions dropped significantly. The community also rallied around the cause. Inspired by James's story, local businesses started offering discounts and job opportunities to veterans. Schools invited veterans to speak to students about their experiences, fostering a greater sense of respect and understanding. Neighborhood groups organized drives to collect essentials for homeless veterans and raised funds to support programs like the Outreach Center. James, for his part, became a mentor at the Outreach Center. He worked with other veterans, sharing his story and helping them navigate their own struggles. His journey became a symbol of resilience and hope, inspiring others to keep fighting even when the odds seemed insurmountable. One evening, Mark attended a community event where James was speaking. Standing in front of a packed room, James shared his story with a mix of humor and raw honesty. "I was ready to give up," he said, his voice steady. "But then someone showed me that it's never too late to turn things around. We all need that one person who believes in us." The crowd erupted into applause, and Mark felt a lump in his throat. He had never expected his actions to have such a ripple effect. Seeing James thrive, surrounded by a community that now cared deeply about its veterans, was more rewarding than he could have imagined. As the event wrapped up, James approached Mark. "You're a hard man to thank," he said with a grin. "But seriously, thank you for everything." Mark smiled, clapping James on the shoulder. "You're the one who did the hard work. I just gave you a push." The evening ended with a renewed sense of purpose for everyone involved. James's story had shown the power of empathy and the importance of taking action, no matter how small. It was a reminder that change doesn't always come from grand gestures. It often starts with a single moment of compassion. For Mark, the experience had been transformative. He no longer saw his job as just enforcing the law. He saw it as an opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives. And for James, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, purpose, and the determination to help others who had been left behind. As time passed, James continued to grow into his new role at the Outreach Center. His natural charisma and first-hand experience made him a trusted figure among the veterans who walked through the center's doors. Many of them came in broken, carrying the weight of years of neglect, trauma, and isolation. But James knew what that felt like. He didn't just offer them advice, he offered them hope. One afternoon, a young veteran named Marcus came to the center. He was in his early 20s, his face pale and drawn. His hands shook as he spoke to James. "I don't know where else to go," Marcus admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm just lost." James listened intently, nodding as Marcus shared his story of being discharged after an injury and struggling to adjust to civilian life. Marcus had been living out of his car for weeks, too ashamed to tell his family about his situation. James placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone," he said firmly. "I've been where you are, and trust me, it gets better. We'll help you." With the Outreach Center's support, Marcus was connected to housing and counseling services. He started attending group therapy sessions and, inspired by James, began volunteering at the center. Watching Marcus transform over the weeks reminded James of his own journey, and it reinforced his determination to keep giving back. Meanwhile, Mark's efforts to push for police reforms began gaining traction. He worked with local leaders to organize workshops for officers, focusing on empathy and understanding when dealing with marginalized communities. The training sessions included role-playing scenarios where officers had to navigate complex situations involving homeless individuals or veterans. These exercises opened their eyes to the challenges people like James faced daily. One officer, Sarah, approached Mark after a session. "I never thought about it like this," she admitted. "It's easy to get caught up in the rules and forget there's a person behind every situation. This training, it's going to change how I do my job." Mark smiled, encouraged by her response. "That's the goal. Every small change adds up." The community's response was just as inspiring. The Outreach Center became a hub of activity, with volunteers of all ages stepping forward to help. Local businesses donated supplies, churches organized fundraisers, and students held food drives. The ripple effect of James's story spread far beyond what anyone had anticipated. One day, Mark and James sat together at the park where their paths had first crossed. It had become a place of reflection for both of them. As they watched children play on the swings, James turned to Mark. "I never thought I'd be sitting here like this. On the other side of it all." Mark chuckled. "Life's funny like that. Sometimes it takes a rough moment to show us what really matters." James nodded, his gaze distant. "I'm grateful, though, for you, for the center, for the second chance, but I can't stop thinking about all the others out there who haven't found their way yet." Mark looked at James, his expression serious. "That's why we keep going. For them." The two men shared a quiet moment of understanding. They both knew their work wasn't done, not by a long shot, but they also knew they had built something that could last, something that could change lives. As the weeks turned into months, James and Mark's efforts continued to make waves. The Outreach Center expanded its services, offering job training programs, mental health resources, and even art therapy sessions. A local artist volunteered to teach painting classes, and soon the walls of the center were adorned with vibrant murals created by the veterans themselves. Each painting told a story of resilience, courage, and hope. James took great pride in seeing the veterans flourish. One day, he watched as Marcus presented a painting he had worked on for weeks. It was a striking image of a lone soldier standing under a sky filled with stars, a beacon of light shining down on him. "This is how I feel now," Marcus explained, his voice steady, "like I've found my light again." The painting brought tears to James's eyes. "That's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've come so far, Marcus." Mark, too, found himself deeply moved by the impact of their work. He had always seen himself as a man of action, someone who could make a difference in small ways, but now he realized the power of community. Together, they were stronger, louder, and more effective than any single person could ever be. One evening, Mark received a letter in the mail. It was from a young woman named Clara, who had seen the news story about James. Clara's father was a veteran who had struggled with PTSD and homelessness before passing away. In her letter, Clara thanked Mark and James for their work, saying it gave her hope that other families wouldn't have to endure what hers did. Mark shared the letter with James, who was equally touched. "This is why we do what we do," James said, holding the letter carefully, "for people like her, for people like her dad." The letter inspired Mark to start a new initiative, a memorial program to honor veterans who had passed away while living on the streets. They organized a candlelight vigil at the park, inviting the community to come together and remember those who had been forgotten. The event was deeply emotional, with families sharing stories of their loved ones and lighting candles in their memory. That night, as the park glowed with the soft light of hundreds of candles, Mark and James stood side by side, their hearts full. It wasn't just about remembrance, it was a call to action. They knew they couldn't change the past, but they could fight for a future where no veteran was left behind. The community's support only grew stronger. Donations poured in, allowing the outreach center to open a second location in a neighboring city. James and Mark traveled to the opening ceremony together, marveling at how far they had come. The new center was even larger than the original, with classrooms, a gym, and a state-of-the-art therapy center. As they cut the ribbon to officially open the new location, the crowd erupted into applause. James looked out at the sea of faces, filled with gratitude and hope. "This isn't just a building," he said during his speech. "It's a promise that we won't stop fighting for our veterans, for our community, for each other." Mark stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. "James taught me something important, that we all have the power to make a difference. It starts with seeing each other as human beings, with listening, with caring. And when we work together, there's nothing we can't accomplish." The crowd cheered, their voices echoing through the crisp evening air. It was a moment of triumph, but also a reminder of the work that still lay ahead. For Mark and James, the journey wasn't just about helping veterans. It was about building a world where everyone had a chance to thrive. As the new outreach center began to flourish, James found himself busier than ever. He wasn't just a volunteer anymore. He was a mentor, a leader, and a symbol of hope for so many veterans who walked through the doors. His days were filled with counseling sessions, job training workshops, and one-on-one talks with those who needed a listening ear. Yet, no matter how hectic things got, James made it a point to personally welcome every new veteran who came seeking help. One morning, James met an older man named Henry. With a weathered face and a slow, shuffling gait, Henry was hesitant to enter the center. James approached him with his characteristic warm smile. "Welcome," he said, extending his hand. "I'm James. How can we help you today?" Henry hesitated before taking James's hand. "I don't know," he muttered. "I've been on the streets for so long, I don't even know what help looks like anymore." James nodded, understanding the pain behind Henry's words. "I've been there too," he said softly. "You don't have to figure it all out today. Just take it one step at a time and we'll be here with you." Henry's journey was slow and challenging, but James remained by his side, encouraging him every step of the way. Over time, Henry began to open up about his past, sharing stories of his time in the Navy and the struggles he faced after returning home. Like so many others, he had fallen through the cracks of the system, left to fend for himself when he needed help the most. As Henry regained his footing, he found solace in the friendships he built at the center. He became a regular participant in group therapy sessions, sharing his experiences and inspiring others with his resilience. For James, watching Henry's transformation was a reminder of why he had dedicated his life to this cause. Meanwhile, Mark continued his push for systemic change. He worked closely with local officials to implement new policies aimed at preventing homelessness among veterans. One of his most significant achievements was securing funding for a program that provided transitional housing for veterans, giving them a stable place to live while they worked toward long-term independence. Mark also partnered with schools to educate young people about the sacrifices veterans made and the challenges they faced after service. Understanding leads to compassion, he explained during a presentation at a high school. If we teach the next generation to care, we can break the cycle of neglect. The outreach center's success began attracting attention from beyond the local community. News outlets ran stories about James and Mark's efforts, highlighting the impact they were making. Donations poured in, allowing them to expand their programs even further. They added vocational training, financial literacy workshops, and even a small library filled with books donated by supporters. One day, James received a letter from a veteran named Carl, who had moved to another state after receiving help from the center. In the letter, Carl wrote about how his life had turned around, thanks to the support he received. He had found a job, reconnected with his family, and was now volunteering at a shelter to help others in need. James read the letter aloud during a staff meeting, his voice filled with emotion. "This is why we do what we do," he said, holding up the letter. "Every life we touch creates a ripple effect. Carl's out there making a difference because someone took the time to help him. That's what this is all about." The staff nodded in agreement, their faces alight with pride and determination. They knew the work was far from over, but letters like Carl's reminded them of the impact they were making. As the months turned into years, James and Mark's partnership grew stronger. Together, they became advocates for veterans on a national level, speaking at conferences and lobbying for policy changes. They shared their story with anyone who would listen, hoping to inspire others to take action. One of their proudest moments came when they were invited to a ceremony honoring veterans at the state capitol. James stood on stage, addressing a crowd that included government officials, military leaders, and fellow veterans. "I'm not a hero," he began, his voice steady but humble. "I'm just a man who was given a second chance, and because of that, I believe it's my duty to help others find their way." The audience erupted into applause, but James wasn't finished. "There are thousands of veterans out there who are still waiting for their second chance," he continued. "We can't forget about them. We have to keep fighting, keep pushing until every veteran has the support they need to rebuild their lives." After the ceremony, a young soldier approached James with tears in his eyes. "You've given me hope," he said. "I've been struggling, but hearing your story makes me believe I can get through this." James placed a hand on the soldier's shoulder. "You're stronger than you think," he said, "and you don't have to do it alone. There's a whole community ready to support you." Back at the outreach center, life continued to flourish. The once small, struggling facility had grown into a thriving hub of hope and opportunity. The walls were now covered with artwork created by veterans, each piece telling a story of resilience and healing. The gym buzzed with activity as veterans and volunteers worked side by side, building strength both physically and emotionally. James often took moments to reflect on how far they had come. Standing in the center's courtyard one evening, he watched the sun set over the city. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, a reminder that even the darkest days could end in beauty. Mark joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Mark said, handing James a cup. "What we've built here." James nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's more than I ever imagined," he admitted. "But it's not just us. It's everyone who believed in this, who fought for it." Mark raised his cup in a toast. "To them, and to all the lives we'll keep changing." James clinked his cup against Mark's, his heart full of gratitude. "To second chances," he said. As they stood there, two men united by a shared mission. They knew their journey was far from over, but they also knew they had already made a difference, and that was enough to keep them going. The Outreach Center was becoming a beacon of hope for the community. But the ripple effects of James and Mark's efforts extended far beyond the walls of the center. Inspired by the success of their programs, other cities began reaching out, hoping to replicate the model and provide similar services to their veterans. This marked the beginning of a national movement, with James and Mark leading the charge. One of the key moments in this expansion came when a major national organization dedicated to veteran welfare invited James to speak at their annual conference. Standing in front of an audience of advocates, policymakers, and military leaders, James shared his story, emphasizing the importance of understanding and addressing the root causes of veteran homelessness. "We can't just treat the symptoms," he said, his voice echoing through the auditorium. "We need to address the systemic issues that lead to these challenges in the first place. That means better mental health care, job training, and a support network that doesn't let anyone fall through the cracks." His speech earned a standing ovation, and by the end of the conference, multiple organizations had pledged to partner with James and Mark's initiative. This partnership brought much-needed resources and expertise to expand their programs. Back at the center, the growth was evident. A new wing was under construction, funded by donations from individuals and organizations moved by James's story. The expansion included a dormitory for veterans in transition, a state-of-the-art therapy center, and a training facility for vocational programs. The goal was to provide not just temporary relief, but long-term solutions. One of the most impactful additions was a peer mentorship program. Veterans who had successfully rebuilt their lives through the center's support became mentors for others just starting their journey. This created a powerful sense of community and accountability, as those who had been helped were now giving back. James often found himself reflecting on how far they had come. One afternoon, he sat in his office reading through thank you letters from veterans who had been helped by the center. Each letter was a testament to the power of compassion and second chances. One letter, in particular, caught his attention. It was from a young woman named Tara, who had served in the Army and struggled with PTSD after her discharge. "Dear Mr. James," the letter began, "I wanted to thank you and everyone at the center for saving my life. When I walked through those doors, I felt like I had nothing left to live for. But the kindness I found here gave me hope again. Today, I have a job, a home, and a sense of purpose. I will never forget what you've done for me." James felt a lump rise in his throat as he read Tara's words. He knew the center's work was making a difference, but moments like this made it all the more real. The community continued to rally around the center, with local businesses and schools contributing in any way they could. Students organized fundraisers, artists donated their work for auctions, and small businesses offered internships for veterans. The sense of unity and purpose was palpable. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Expanding the program nationwide required navigating complex bureaucracies and overcoming skepticism from those who doubted the feasibility of such an ambitious project. Mark, with his legal expertise and unshakable determination, took the lead in these efforts. "We've proven this works," Mark said, during a meeting with state officials. Now, it's time to take what we've learned and scale it. This isn't just about one city or one group of people. It's about changing the way we think about supporting our veterans. The officials listened, and one by one, states began adopting the model. Pilot programs were launched in cities across the country, each one building on the foundation James and Mark had laid. As the movement grew, James became a sought-after speaker and advisor. But he never let the spotlight distract him from his roots. He continued to spend time at the center, mentoring veterans and participating in day-to-day activities. For him, this work was deeply personal, and he never wanted to lose sight of that. One evening, as the sun set over the city, James sat with Mark on the steps of the center. They watched as veterans and their families gathered for a community barbecue, laughing and sharing stories. "Look at this," James said, gesturing toward the lively scene. "This is what it's all about." Mark nodded, a satisfied smile on his face. "It's incredible, isn't it? To think this all started with a moment of injustice." James leaned back, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's funny how life works. That moment could have broken me. But instead, it brought me here." Mark clapped him on the shoulder. "And because of you, countless lives have been changed. Never forget that." James smiled, his heart full of gratitude. "I won't," he said. "But this isn't the end. We've still got work to do." As the night went on, James mingled with the crowd, sharing laughs and stories with those who had become like family. The sense of community was stronger than ever, a testament to the power of resilience and the belief that no one is beyond redemption. The tension in the room was palpable as Officer Ryan listened to the heartfelt words of the homeless veteran, Thomas. Despite his preconceived notions, Ryan began to see a glimmer of humanity in the man he had wrongfully judged. He was no longer looking at a troublemaker, but a person who had sacrificed for his country and endured unimaginable struggles afterward. As the pieces of Thomas's life fell into place, Ryan felt an unfamiliar pang of guilt. He had always prided himself on upholding the law, but had he truly been serving justice? Thomas spoke of his years of service in the military, his bravery, the comrades he had lost, and the dreams he had to return home and rebuild his life. But the reality was harsh. The support he expected was nowhere to be found, and with no family to lean on, he ended up on the streets. Ryan's hardened exterior cracked. He had never considered what it might feel like to lose everything, despite giving everything. In that moment, he saw himself in Thomas, not as a cop, but as a human being who could have ended up in a similar situation if life had taken a different turn. Deciding he needed to make things right, Ryan took immediate action. He contacted the department's community outreach program and even reached out to a local nonprofit organization specializing in veteran support. Ryan was determined to ensure Thomas received the help he desperately needed. But Ryan didn't stop there. He approached his captain, admitting his mistake and requesting the charges against Thomas be dropped. It wasn't an easy conversation, but Ryan knew it was the right thing to do. The captain, impressed by Ryan's newfound integrity, agreed. Next day, Thomas was released, his eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. Ryan personally drove him to the shelter the nonprofit had arranged, ensuring he had a place to stay and a fresh start. Ryan also vowed to visit regularly and help Thomas find employment, showing that he was willing to go beyond his duty as an officer to make amends. The transformation in Officer Ryan didn't go unnoticed. Word spread about the cop who turned his mistake into an opportunity to right a wrong. The story became a beacon of hope, highlighting the power of accountability and compassion. Thomas began receiving help from multiple sources, and with Ryan's assistance, he started to rebuild his life. Months later, Thomas stood before a crowd at a community event organized to honor veterans and promote better support systems. Dressed sharply and exuding confidence, he shared his journey from a homeless veteran to someone who had rediscovered hope. He thanked the organizations that had helped him and, most unexpectedly, Officer Ryan. Ryan, standing at the back of the crowd, nodded humbly. He knew his role had been small, but seeing Thomas thrive made every effort worthwhile. Thomas ended his speech with a powerful statement. People often judge us by what they see, but they don't take the time to learn our stories. I hope this story reminds everyone that understanding and kindness can change lives. As the audience cheered, Ryan reflected on how much his life had changed. No longer quick to judge, he approached his work with more empathy and a genuine desire to serve and protect everyone fairly. What would you have done if you were in Officer Ryan's position? Do you believe people can truly change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring content. Together, we can learn to see the humanity in everyone and create a kinder world.